The autumn of 1878 brought two things to the town of Willow Bend, Kansas: a plague of grasshoppers that ate half the county's wheat, and a marriage proposal that would set the whole town talking for years to come. Marcella Walker stood behind the counter of her father's general store, wiping down the same patch of oak wood she had wiped a dozen times already, watching through the front window as Marshal Elias Grant tied his horse to the post outside. She knew what he had come to ask. Everyone in Willow Bend knew. He had been courting her in his stiff and dutiful way for the better part of 6 months, bringing her ribbons from Dodge City and telling her stories about the outlaws he had chased down and the men he had brought to justice. He was a good man by most accounts, honest, steady, the kind of man a sensible woman was supposed to want. Marcella was 22 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a plain bonnet and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. She had grown up in Willow Bend since she was a girl of 8, when her father, Thomas Walker, had brought the family west from Ohio to open his store. She had buried her mother 3 winters past, and since then she had run the household and the books for her father, who was kind but absent-minded and grew more tired every year. The bell above the door rang, and Marshal Grant stepped inside, removing his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who had learned manners in a town far grander than this one. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a mustache trimmed close and a silver star pinned crooked on his vest, as it always was, no matter how many times Marcella wanted to reach over and straighten it. "Miss Walker," he said, "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course, Marshal." She set down her rag and folded her hands atop the counter. He glanced toward the back room, where her father was counting nails into small paper sacks, and lowered his voice. Perhaps somewhere more private. They stepped out onto the porch, where the afternoon sun slanted long and gold across the dusty street. A wagon rattled by, driven by old Mr. Doss, and somewhere down the road, a dog barked at nothing in particular. Marshal Grant turned his hat over in his hands, an uncharacteristic nervousness creasing his brow. "Miss Walker," he began, "I have thought on this a great deal, and I believe the time has come to speak plainly. I am 31 years old. I have a house in town, a steady wage from the territory, and prospects that will only grow as this county settles. I have watched you these past months, and I have come to believe that you would make a fine wife for a man in my position. I am asking you to marry me." Marcella looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing cruel in his face, nothing false in his offer. He meant every word of it, and in another life, perhaps, she might have said yes without a second thought. A marshal's wife would want for nothing. She would have a fine house, new dresses each season, protection from the dangers that stalked every frontier town. Her father would be relieved of a daughter's upkeep. It was by every practical measure the right answer, but when she tried to imagine years stretched out before her at Elias Grant's side, she felt nothing stir in her chest, no warmth, no quickening of the pulse, only a quiet, polite emptiness, the kind of feeling one might have toward a well-made piece of furniture. "Marshal Grant," she said carefully, "I am deeply honored, truly I am, but I cannot give you the answer you are hoping for." His jaw tightened, though he kept his composure. "May I ask why?" "Because I do not love you," she said, as gently as such words could be said. "And I think a man like you, a man who has given so much to keeping other folks safe, deserves a wife who loves him with her whole heart, not one who married him for the sake of comfort. Comfort is not so small a thing on this frontier, Miss Walker." "No," she agreed, "it is not, but it is not enough for me." He studied her a moment longer, and something in his eyes softened just slightly, though his pride kept most of it hidden. "Is there someone else?" She thought of Nathan Hale before she could stop herself, and she felt her cheeks warm despite the cool edge in the autumn air. "There is no one," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was not entirely certain they were true. Marshal Grant settled his hat back onto his head. "Then I will not press you further, but my offer stands, Miss Walker, should you change your mind. A woman alone on this frontier finds few enough chances for security. I would ask you to remember that." He turned and walked back to his horse. mounted with the easy grace of a man used to being obeyed, and rode off down the street without looking back. Marcella stood on the porch a long while after he had gone, watching the dust settle, wondering why her heart had not leapt at the promise of a comfortable, protected life, and wondering, too, why the face that kept rising unbidden in her mind belonged to a man who owned little more than a mule, a leaking roof, and 40 acres of stubborn Kansas dirt. Nathan Hale had come to Willow Bend 2 years before, a quiet man of 26 with sun-browned skin and hands calloused from work that never seemed to end. He had bought his land cheap, a stretch of prairie that everyone said was too dry and too rocky to farm, and he had set about proving everyone wrong with a stubbornness that bordered on foolishness. He had built his own house, board by board, and dug his own well, and when the wheat failed the first year, he had gone without new boots so he could buy seed for the second. Marcella had first spoken to him properly on a spring morning, when he came into her father's store to buy nails, and found he did not have quite enough money to pay for them. She remembered the flush of embarrassment on his face, the way he had started to put the nails back on the counter, and how she had quietly told her father that she would cover the difference from her own small wages, and that Nathan could pay her back whenever the harvest came in. He had looked at her then with such startled gratitude that she had felt something shift inside her chest, small and unfamiliar, like a seed cracking open beneath the soil. He had paid her back 3 weeks later, every cent, counted out carefully in coins that smelled faintly of the earth. He had dug them from beneath his floorboards. And from that day on, whenever he came to town, he found some reason to linger near her counter, asking about the weather, about her father's health, about nothing in particular, until she began to look forward to the creak of the store's front door in a way she could not quite explain. That evening, after Marshal Grant's proposal, Marcella walked the mile out to the edge of town where the road forked toward the Hale farm. She told herself she was only going to check on the Whitfield family's new baby, since Nathan's land lay along the same road, but when she reached the fork, her feet turned toward the farm without her truly deciding to let them. She found Nathan in his field, working alongside his mule to clear a stand of dead corn stalks the grasshoppers had left behind. He was shirtless in the last of the day's heat, his back and shoulders slick with sweat, and when he saw her approaching along the fence line, he straightened so quickly he nearly stumbled. "Miss Walker." He grabbed his shirt from where it hung on a fence post and pulled it on, though not before she had already seen more of him than was proper for an unmarried woman to see of an unmarried man. "I did not expect company. I was walking," she said, which was true enough, though it did not explain why she had walked so far. "I hope I am not intruding." "No." He came to the fence, resting his forearms on the top rail, and looked at her with the same steady attention he always gave her, as though she were the only interesting thing in a very large and empty prairie. "You are never an intrusion, Miss Walker." She glanced past him at the ruined cornfield, the stalks brown and chewed to nothing. "The grasshoppers were hard on you." "Hard on everyone," he said. "But I have got the wheat coming up in the north field still, and I am hoping it will be enough to see me through winter and leave seed for spring." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she had come to recognize as his particular kind of worry, the kind he never spoke of directly. "It will be enough, it has to be. You always say that. It is always true," he said, and something like a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "So far, anyway." They stood in silence a moment, the sun sinking low and orange behind him, turning the ruined field to something almost beautiful in its dying light. Marcella found herself studying the line of his jaw, the calluses on his hands where they rested on the fence rail, and she thought of Marshal Grant's silver star, polished and gleaming, and how it had never once made her feel the way this man's rough, sunburned hands did simply by resting a few inches from her own. "Marshal Grant asked me to marry him today," she said before she could stop herself. Nathan went very still. "Did he?" I said no. He did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully even, though she thought she heard something beneath it, something he was working hard to keep hidden. "That is your business, Miss Walker, not mine to comment on." "I am telling you because I want you to know," she said, and her heart was pounding now, loud enough she thought he might hear it across the small distance between them. "I want you to know that a marshal asked for my hand, with a house in town and a steady wage, and I told him no." "Why?" The word came out rougher than he seemed to intend. "Because I do not love him," she said simply, "and there is someone else I think of far more than I ought to admit." Nathan's eyes met hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The wind moved through the dead cornstalks with a sound like dry paper, and somewhere off in the distance a coyote called, answered a moment later by another farther still. Marcella. It was the first time he had ever used her given name, and it landed on her like something warm poured slow down her spine. "I have got nothing to offer a woman like you. 40 acres of dirt that half the time will not even grow what I plant in it. A house with a roof that leaks when it rains hard. I have thought about you more than a man in my position has any right to think about anyone, but I could never ask you to give up a comfortable life for the little I have got." "You have not asked me anything," she said softly. "No," he admitted, "I have not." "Then perhaps you should." He looked at her as though she had struck him, astonishment breaking wide across his face. And then, slowly, he reached across the fence rail and took her hand in his, careful and gentle, as though she were something that might break if he were not exceedingly tender with her. "Marcella Walker," he said, "I am not going to ask you to marry me tonight, standing in a ruined cornfield with dirt under my nails and nothing to my name but debt and a mule that is older than I am. When I ask you, and I mean to ask you, I want to be able to offer you something worth having." "I do not care about what you have," she said. "I care about who you are." "Give me time," he said. "Let me prove I am worth the risk you would be taking. Let me show you I can build something here, even out of dirt like this." She smiled despite the ache in her chest at his refusal, however gentle it had been. "I will wait," she said, "but do not take too long, Nathan Hale." Marshals do not often ask a woman twice. He laughed at that, a real laugh, warm and surprised, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh so freely, and she thought she would have walked twice the mile home just to hear it once more. Word of Marcella's refusal spread through Willow Bend faster than the grasshoppers had spread through the wheat fields, and by the following Sunday, half the congregation at the little clapboard church was whispering about it before the service even began. Marshal Grant sat in his usual pew near the front, his back straight, his face arranged into careful indifference, though everyone noted he did not once glance toward the Walker family's pew the entire service. Marcella's father, Thomas Walker, said nothing about it directly, though that evening over supper he set down his fork with a heaviness that told her a conversation was coming. "I heard the marshal asked for your hand," he said. "He did. And you turned him down." "I did." Thomas was quiet a moment, chewing slowly, his graying beard catching crumbs the way it always did. He was a practical man, a store owner who understood the value of $1 and the risk of a bad harvest better than most, and Marcella braced herself for the lecture she expected to follow. "Was it the Hale boy?" he asked instead, and there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of tired curiosity. Marcella's fork stilled over her plate. "How did you know?" "I am not blind, Marcella. I have watched the way you look toward that road every time he comes into the store. I have watched the way he finds reasons to linger longer than any purchase requires." He sighed, and there was something almost fond beneath the exhaustion in his face. "Your mother used to look at me the same way once before the years wore some of it down. It is not a look a father forgets once he has seen it." "I did not mean to disappoint you," Marcella said. "The marshal would have given us security, given you peace of mind." "Security," Thomas repeated and shook his head slowly. "I did not bring your mother out to Kansas because it was secure, Marcella. I brought her because I loved her, and because she loved me enough to leave behind everything comfortable and familiar for a chance at something better, even if that better thing came wrapped in hardship. I would be a poor father indeed if I asked you to settle for less than what she and I found together, simply because it frightens me to see you take the same risk." Marcella felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. "You are not angry. I am worried," he admitted. "Nathan Hale is a good man as far as I have seen, but goodness does not always put bread on the table, and this land has broken stronger men than him these past years. But if it is him you want, then I will not stand between you and your own heart. I only ask that you go into it with your eyes open, and not simply because his hands are rough and his smile is crooked and he makes your cheeks go pink whenever his name comes up in conversation." Marcella laughed despite herself, wiping at her eyes. "Is it so obvious?" "Painfully," her father said, and for the first time that evening he smiled. The weeks that followed brought an early frost, hard and biting, that settled over Willow Bend and turned the last of the seasons green to brown and gray almost overnight. Nathan worked from before dawn until well after dark, bringing in what wheat had survived the grasshoppers, mending fences the wind had knocked loose, and patching the worst of the leaks in his roof before the winter rains could turn his house into a swamp. Marcella saw him only rarely during those weeks, snatched conversations across the store counter when he came to buy what few supplies he could afford. But even those brief moments left her feeling as though something important were quietly, steadily being built between them, board by board, the same patient way he built everything else in his life. It was in late November, on a day when the sky hung low and gray with the promise of the season's first real snow, that trouble came to Willow Bend in a form no one had expected. A man named Silas Renner rode into town on a horse lathered with sweat despite the cold, claiming a legal right to a stretch of land that included not only 3 neighboring farms but Nathan Hale's 40 acres as well. He carried papers, official-looking and stamped with a seal from the Territorial Land Office, that named him the rightful owner of a parcel that had, according to those papers, never been properly filed by the homesteaders who currently occupied it. The town gathered outside the land office to hear the argument unfold, Marshal Grant standing between Renner and the gathering crowd of angry farmers, his hand resting near his revolver though he had not yet drawn it. "This is a mistake," Nathan said, his voice tight with a controlled fury Marcella had never heard from him before. "I filed my claim proper 3 years back with the office in Topeka. I have got the papers to prove it." "Then I would suggest you find them," Renner said coolly. He was a lean man with a hawkish face and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they touched, and something about him made Marcella's skin crawl the moment she laid eyes on him. "Because the office in Topeka has no record of your claim, Mr. Hale, only mine." "That is a lie." "Careful," Marshal Grant said, stepping between them, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Nobody is losing their land today. Mr. Renner, you will give this office time to verify your papers through proper channels before anyone speaks another word about ownership. Is that understood?" Renner's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. "Of course, Marshal." "I am a patient man." His gaze slid toward Nathan, cold and assessing. "But patience only lasts so long when a man knows he is right." He turned and rode off toward the small hotel at the edge of town, leaving behind a silence thick with worry. Nathan stood staring after him, his jaw set, his hands clenched at his sides, and Marcella went to him before she could think better of it, laying her hand against his arm. "He is lying," she said. "He has to be." "I know I filed that claim," Nathan said, though there was a tremor beneath his certainty that frightened her. "I remember the clerk's face. I remember the ink still wet on the paper when he handed me my copy." He shook his head slowly. "But if the Topeka office has no record, it will not matter what I remember. It will only matter what is written down. Where is your copy?" "The one the clerk gave you." Nathan's face went pale. "In the house. In a tin box under the floorboards near the stove." He looked at her and something like dread crossed his features. "Marcella, if that man means to make trouble and he has already ridden past my farm on his way into town today, There is no telling what he might have already done. They rode out together, Marcella insisting despite Nathan's protests that she was coming whether he liked it or not, and the mile to his farm felt longer than any mile she had ever traveled. When they arrived, Nathan swung down from his mule and ran into the house, and Marcella followed close behind, her heart hammering. The tin box was gone. The floorboard that had concealed it lay pried up and cast aside, and the small space beneath it sat empty save for a scattering of dust and a single rusted nail. Nathan sank to his knees beside the empty hiding place, his hands pressed against his face, and for a long, terrible moment Marcella thought he might weep. She knelt beside him and put her arms around him without hesitation, and he leaned into her, his shoulders shaking with something between fury and despair. 3 years, he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. 3 years of breaking my back over this dirt, and he means to take it with a stolen paper and a lie. We will not let him, Marcella said fiercely. There has to be some way to prove the claim was filed, a record somewhere, a witness, something. The clerk who filed it for me, Nathan said slowly, lifting his head. His name was Corwin, Ezra Corwin. He worked the Topeka land office for years before I filed. If Renner has somehow bought off or bullied whoever works there now, Corwin might still remember. He might have kept his own records separate from the office's. Then we find him. Topeka is 2 days' ride from here, Marcella. And even then, there is no guarantee he remembers a single claim among the hundreds he must have processed, or that he would still be willing to speak on my behalf against a man with money enough to forge land papers. Then we will make him remember, Marcella said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Nathan Hale, I did not turn down a marshal's proposal to watch you lose everything you have built without a fight. We will ride to Topeka, and we will find this Ezra Corwin, and we will bring back whatever proof there is to be found. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful and disbelieving moving behind his eyes, and then he took her hand and pressed it to his lips, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it stole the breath from her lungs. I do not deserve you, he said quietly. You deserve exactly what you have worked for, she said. Nothing more and nothing less. Now come, we are wasting daylight. They told Thomas Walker of their plan that evening, and though he worried aloud about the impropriety of his unmarried daughter riding 2 days across the prairie in the company of a man she was not yet promised to, he did not forbid it. Instead, he pressed a small purse of coins into Marcella's hand, enough for lodging and meals along the way, and made her promise to stay at respectable establishments and to send word the moment they reached Topeka. Bring back what you need, he told Nathan, gripping his shoulder with a firmness that carried its own kind of blessing. That land is yours. I have watched you earn it with my own eyes these 3 years past. I will not see some paper-pushing swindler take it from you while I have breath left to speak against it. They set out before dawn the next morning, the sky still bruised purple and gray, frost crunching beneath the horses' hooves. Marcella rode a borrowed mare from her father's stable, and Nathan rode his own weathered horse, the mule left behind under the care of a neighbor. The prairie stretched wide and empty around them, the grass gone brown and brittle with the season, and for the first miles they rode largely in silence, each lost in their own worry. It was near midday, as they stopped to rest the horses beside a shallow creek, that Nathan finally spoke of what weighed on him. If we cannot find proof, he said, staring out at the water, I will lose the farm, all of it. 3 years of work gone to a man who never once put a hand to that soil. We will find proof, Marcella said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. And if we do not, he turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his face was almost unbearable. I would understand, Marcella, if that changed things between us. A woman deserves a man who can offer her a future, not one who might be homeless and destitute within the month. Marcella reached out and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her directly. Nathan Hale, listen to me. I did not fall in love with your land. I did not fall in love with your house or your wheat fields or the promise of some comfortable future. I fell in love with you. The way you work until your hands bleed and never once complain. The way you gave me back every cent you owed me, though you could have easily let it go and I would never have said a word. The way you looked at me across that fence rail as though I were something precious, when half the men in this territory would not think twice about a woman with no dowry and no particular beauty to speak of. You are beautiful, Nathan said immediately, fiercely, as though the suggestion otherwise offended him personally. You are the most beautiful thing in this whole territory, Marcella Walker, and any man who cannot see that is a fool. She smiled, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. My point, she said, is that I love you, dirt and devotion and all, and no piece of paper or lack of one is going to change that. Now, we have a long ride ahead of us still. Let us not waste it in doubt. They reached Topeka on the evening of the second day, weary and wind-burned, and found lodging at a modest boarding house near the edge of the growing town. The territorial capital bustled with a kind of energy Willow Bend never saw. Wagons and horses crowding the streets, the sound of construction ringing out from half a dozen new buildings rising against the darkening sky. Marcella had never seen so many people gathered in one place, and despite her exhaustion, she felt a flicker of the same restless excitement that had once brought her family west from Ohio. The following morning, they made their way to the land office, a squat brick building near the center of town, and asked after Ezra Corwin. The clerk behind the counter, a young man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, informed them that Corwin had retired from the office 2 years prior but still lived in town, in a small house near the river. They found the house without much trouble, a modest structure with a well-tended garden gone to winter dormancy, and it was Corwin himself who answered their knock, a stooped man in his 60s with kind eyes and a shock of white hair. Hale, he said slowly, after Nathan had explained their trouble and given his name. Nathan Hale, 40 acres near Willow Bend, filed spring of 75. He squinted as though sifting through years of memory. You had a scar on your left hand from a plow blade, if I recall. You mentioned it while I was drawing up the paper, said it still ached when the weather turned cold. Nathan held up his left hand, and there, faint but visible, was the scar he spoke of. I remember you, Corwin said, with something like satisfaction. I remember most of the men I filed for, if I am honest, though the office likes to pretend a clerk is nothing more than a machine for stamping papers. I kept my own ledger for my own peace of mind all the years I worked there. Every claim, every name, every date. Come inside, both of you. Let us see what we can find. The ledger, when Corwin produced it from a trunk in his back room, was a thick, leather-bound volume filled with careful, cramped handwriting, and it took the better part of an hour of searching before Corwin's finger landed on the entry they sought. Here, he said, Nathan Hale, 40 acres, Section 14, Township 11, filed the 3rd of April, 1875. Witnessed by myself and by the acting registrar, one Josiah Fenwick. He looked up at them. This is a legal record, kept independent of the office's own files. If someone has tampered with the official record, this ledger stands as evidence that your claim was indeed filed, properly and in order, 3 years past. Will it hold up? Marcella asked. Against a man with money enough to forge papers. It will hold up in any territorial court in Kansas, Corwin said firmly. I would be glad to testify to it myself if it comes to that. I did not spend 20 years keeping honest records so that some swindler could steal a hard-working man's land out from under him. Nathan's hands were shaking as he closed the ledger, and when he looked up at Corwin, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I do not know how to thank you. Thank me by holding on to that land, Corwin said, and by taking care of this young woman who rode 2 days across the prairie to fight for you. Not every man is lucky enough to find someone willing to do that. They left Topeka the following morning with a signed and witnessed copy of the ledger entry tucked carefully into Nathan's saddlebag, along with a letter from Corwin himself, stating his willingness to testify before any court that questioned the claim's legitimacy. The ride home felt lighter than the ride there had been. despite the cold wind that picked up as they crossed back into the open prairie. And more than once Marcella caught Nathan looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between gratitude and wonder and a fierce, quiet joy. They stopped for the night at the same creek where they had rested on the journey out, and as they sat by a small fire built from gathered brush, the stars spread thick and bright above the empty land, Nathan finally spoke the words she had been waiting to hear. "Marcella," he said, "I still do not have much to offer you. The farm may yet be saved, thanks to you and to Ezra Corwin's good sense, but it will be years before it is anything more than 40 acres of stubborn dirt, and a house that leaks when it rains too hard." "Nathan, let me finish," he said, and there was something in his voice, some new steadiness, that made her fall silent. "I have thought these past 2 days about everything you said, about how you did not fall in love with what I have, but with who I am. I do not know that I have ever been loved that way before, Marcella, not by anyone." He reached into his coat and drew out a small ring, plain and unadorned, fashioned from a thin band of silver. "I made this myself," he admitted, a flush rising in his cheeks, "from a coin I found buried near the well when I dug it 3 years back. I have been carrying it since the summer, waiting for a moment I thought might be right, and I do not know that a moment will ever feel more right than this one, sitting here with you under this sky, after everything we have just been through together." He took her hand, his own trembling slightly, and looked at her with a depth of feeling that stole every clever word from her mind. "Marcella Walker, I love you. I have loved you since the day you covered the cost of my nails and looked at me like I was not simply another poor farmer scraping by. I cannot promise you an easy life. I cannot promise you fine dresses or a house in town or the comfort a marshal's wife might expect. But I can promise you every ounce of devotion I have got in me for as long as I live, and I am asking you with my whole heart if you will be my wife." Tears spilled freely down Marcella's cheeks now, and she laughed even as she cried, nodding before she could even find her voice to speak the word aloud. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Nathan Hale, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her all along, and when he leaned forward to kiss her, gentle and searching, Marcella felt something settle deep within her chest, a certainty more solid than any comfort Marshal Grant could have ever offered her. This was the life she wanted. Dirt and devotion and all. They returned to Willow Bend 3 days later, sunburned and weary but triumphant, and the news of their engagement spread through town almost as quickly as news of Renner's swindle had. Marshal Grant, to his credit, offered his congratulations with a stiff but genuine handshake, and Marcella thought she saw, beneath his composed exterior, something like relief that the matter had at last been settled, freeing him from a hope he had likely known, deep down, was never going to be realized. Silas Renner did not take the news of Corwin's ledger well. He appeared at the land office the following week, his hawkish face drawn tight with fury, and attempted to dispute the record's legitimacy, claiming Corwin's ledger was nothing more than an old man's fabrication. But Marshal Grant, who had taken a personal interest in the matter once word of the forged papers reached him, had sent his own inquiry to the Topeka office in the intervening days, and the response that came back confirmed what they already knew. The seal on Renner's papers did not match any seal used by the Territorial Land Office in the years he claimed the document had been issued. It was a forgery, poorly executed by a man who had clearly hoped no one in a small frontier town would think to check so carefully. Renner was arrested within the week, and though he protested loudly of his innocence all the way to the jailhouse, the evidence against him was damning enough that even his hired lawyer, summoned hastily from Dodge City, could offer little in his defense. He would stand trial in the spring, and word later reached Willow Bend that he had attempted the same scheme in 2 other counties, though none of his previous victims had possessed a friend as thorough as Ezra Corwin or a fiancé as fierce as Marcella Walker. With the matter of the land settled and Nathan's claim secured beyond any further question, the town of Willow Bend turned its attention to the wedding, and there was a great deal of it to discuss, for a wedding was a rare enough thing on the frontier that the whole town felt entitled to some part in the planning of it. Marcella's father insisted on providing the wedding dress himself, ordering fine white cotton and lace from a catalog that took nearly a month to arrive, and Marcella spent long evenings by lamplight sewing the dress herself, with her father's sister, Aunt Prudence, who had come out from Ohio for the occasion, offering advice and criticism in roughly equal measure. Nathan, for his part, spent every spare hour repairing his house, determined that his bride would not spend her first winter as his wife beneath a leaking roof. He rebuilt the chimney, patched every gap in the walls with fresh clay and straw, and built, with careful and loving attention, a proper bed frame to replace the simple cot he had slept on for 3 years, carving into the headboard a small pattern of wheat stalks that Marcella would not discover until their wedding night, when she ran her fingers over the wood and felt tears prick at her eyes at the thought of him laboring over something so small and so beautiful, purely for her sake. The wedding took place on a clear, cold day in the middle of December, in the same clapboard church where Marcella had sat through so many Sunday services, watching Marshal Grant carefully avoid looking her way. Nearly the entire town turned out for the occasion, filling the small building to capacity and spilling out onto the church steps, drawn as much by curiosity about the scandal of Renner's forged claim as by genuine well-wishing, though Marcella suspected that, by the time the ceremony ended, even the most skeptical among them had been won over by the evident devotion between the bride and groom. Marcella wore her mother's pearl earrings alongside the dress she had sewn herself, and when she walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, she found Nathan waiting for her at the front of the church in a suit that had clearly been borrowed, slightly too large in the shoulders, his hair combed back with more care than she had ever seen him give it, and his eyes, when they met hers, filled with a wonder so plain and unguarded that she nearly forgot to breathe. The preacher, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Alcott who had married half the couples in the county over the past decade, spoke of devotion and partnership, and the particular kind of love that grew not from comfort but from shared hardship, and Marcella thought, listening to him, that she had never heard a truer description of what she felt for the man standing before her. When the time came for vows, Nathan's voice shook slightly as he spoke, though his eyes never left hers. "Marcella Walker," he said, "I do not have much to promise you, save everything I am. I promise to work this land beside you, not for you, so that whatever we build together. I promise to never let a day pass without telling you that I love you, even on the days when the wheat fails and the roof leaks and the world feels like it is trying its hardest to break us. I promise you my whole heart, for as long as I have breath to give it." Marcella, when it came her turn, found her own voice steadier than she expected, though her heart pounded fierce enough that she thought the whole church must surely hear it. "Nathan Hale, I turned down comfort and security because I knew, deep down, that they were not what I truly wanted. I wanted you. I wanted a man who would work himself to exhaustion rather than ask for help, and who would still find the energy to carve wheat stalks into a headboard simply because he thought it might make me smile. I promise you my devotion, in equal measure to yours, and I promise that whatever dirt this land throws at us, we will turn it into something worth having together." The kiss that followed was met with a cheer from the gathered townsfolk loud enough to rattle the church's small windows, and even Marshal Grant, standing near the back with his hat held respectfully against his chest, was seen to smile, genuine and unguarded, before slipping quietly out to spare himself the awkwardness of the celebration that followed. The wedding supper was held in the churchyard despite the cold, tables borrowed from half the households in town groaning under the weight of dishes everyone had contributed, and Marcella's father wept openly and without shame when he stood to offer a toast, speaking of her mother and how proud she would have been, and of how, He had never seen his daughter look so thoroughly, unmistakably happy. That night, Nathan carried Marcella across the threshold of the house he had built with his own hands, the same house that had nearly been stolen from him only weeks before. And as she looked around at the freshly patched walls and the small fire crackling in the newly rebuilt hearth, she felt a swelling contentment so complete it nearly brought her to tears again. "It is not much," Nathan said quietly, watching her survey the small space, old worry creeping back into his voice despite everything that had happened. "It is everything," Marcella said, turning to face him. "It is ours." The winter that followed was harsh, as Kansas winters so often were, with snow piling deep against the fences and the wind howling across the flat land with a fury that made the small house shudder and groan. But inside, warmed by the fire and by each other, Marcella and Nathan settled into the particular rhythm of married life, learning each other's habits and moods in the close quarters of their small home. She learned that he liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and that he hummed old hymns under his breath while he worked, without ever seeming to notice he was doing it. He learned that she talked to herself while she cooked, muttering half-formed recipes and corrections, and that she could not fall asleep unless the window was cracked open even the smallest amount, no matter how cold the night. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it arrived with a vengeance, the prairie exploding into green almost overnight, wildflowers scattering purple and gold across land that had seemed lifeless only weeks before. Nathan planted his fields with a hope and energy Marcella had never seen in him before, no longer weighed down by the fear of losing everything to Renner's forged claim, and she worked alongside him whenever her own household duties allowed, learning to plant and tend and harvest with the same patient determination she saw in him every single day. It was in early June, as the wheat stood green and healthy in the fields for the first time in 3 years, that Marcella began to suspect she was carrying a child. She said nothing to Nathan at first, wanting to be certain, but when Dr. Emery from the neighboring town confirmed what she already suspected, she rode straight home from his office, her heart so full she thought it might burst before she reached the farm. She found Nathan in the north field, checking the wheat for signs of the pests that had plagued them the year before, and when she called his name, something in her voice must have carried across the distance, because he dropped his tools immediately and came running. "Marcella, what is it? Are you—" "I am well," she said, laughing at the panic on his face. "Better than well, Nathan, I am carrying our child." He stood stock still for a long moment, staring at her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue, and then slowly, a smile broke across his face so wide and so joyful that it transformed him entirely, stripping away every trace of the worry he so often carried. "A child," he repeated, wonder thick in his voice. "Our child." He crossed the remaining distance between them and lifted her clean off her feet, spinning her once before setting her carefully back down, as though suddenly remembering she was no longer to be handled so roughly. "Marcella, this is everything. This is more than I ever dared hope for." "You dared hope for plenty," she reminded him, still laughing. "You dared hope for a wife and a saved farm and wheat that actually grows instead of getting eaten by grasshoppers. And now a child," he said, pressing his forehead to hers, his hands cradling her face with a tenderness that never failed to undo her. "I love you, Marcella Hale. I do not think I will ever stop being amazed that you chose this life, that you chose me. I would choose you again every single time," she said, dirt and devotion included. The child, born the following February during a snowstorm that kept even Dr. Emery from reaching the farm in time, was delivered instead with the help of the neighboring Whitfield woman, who had assisted at enough births to manage without a doctor's presence. He was a healthy boy, with a shock of dark hair like his mother's, and a stubborn set to his jaw that even the midwife remarked looked exactly like his father's. They named him Thomas, after Marcella's father, who wept for the second time in as many years when he came to see his grandson for the first time, cradling the infant with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his large, work-worn hands. Thomas Hale grew quickly, as children on the frontier so often did, out of necessity as much as nature. And by the time he was 3 years old, he was already following his father through the fields, his small legs struggling to match Nathan's long strides, his laughter carrying across the wheat whenever Nathan lifted him onto his shoulders to survey the crops together. 2 years after Thomas's birth, Marcella gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Ruth, after Nathan's own mother, who had passed some years before he came west, and whom he spoke of only rarely, though always with a quiet, aching fondness. Ruth was a fierce, dark-eyed child from the moment she drew her first breath, and she grew into a girl who followed her older brother everywhere he went, refusing to be left behind no matter how many times Thomas complained that girls had no business helping with farm chores. The farm itself flourished in those years, no longer the struggling, uncertain venture it had been when Nathan first broke the ground with nothing but stubbornness and a second-hand plow. The wheat came in strong most seasons, and what the grasshoppers or the weather failed to spoil, Nathan and Marcella found ways to stretch and preserve, until the house that had once leaked in every hard rain became, board by board and year by year, a proper home, added onto twice as the family grew, with a wide front porch Nathan built specifically so that Marcella could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset the way she had always loved to do. Marshal Grant, for his part, never did marry, though he remained a fixture in Willow Bend for many years, respected and relied upon by the community even as new marshals came and went in neighboring towns. He and Nathan developed, over time, an unlikely friendship, born first from the shared ordeal of exposing Renner's forgery, and cemented gradually through years of small kindnesses and mutual respect. It was Marshal Grant, in fact, who stood as a witness some 6 years after the wedding when Nathan finally paid off the last of the debt on his land, a debt that had hung over the farm since before Marcella had ever known him. And it was Marshal Grant who raised his glass that evening at the small celebration Marcella insisted on holding, toasting to a man he once might have considered a rival, but had long since come to consider a friend. To Nathan Hale, the marshal said, standing in the golden light of a summer evening, the porch crowded with neighbors and family, who took nothing but dirt and turned it into everything worth having. He glanced at Marcella, and there was warmth in his eyes now, unguarded and sincere. And to Marcella Hale, who saw the worth in him before the rest of us fools ever did. Ezra Corwin, too, remained a part of their lives in the years that followed, corresponding regularly with Nathan by letter and visiting Willow Bend twice before his health finally failed him, always delighted to see how the family he had helped to save had grown and thrived. When word reached them of his passing, some 8 years after that fateful ride to Topeka, Nathan wept openly, and Marcella held him through the worst of his grief, understanding fully the depth of gratitude he carried for the old clerk who had, in the end, saved far more than a single piece of land. By the time their third child arrived, a boy they named Ezra in honor of the man who had saved their family's future, Nathan Hale's 40 acres had grown, through careful purchase and diligent saving, to nearly 200, and the small, leaking house he had built alone in his first year on the frontier had become the heart of a sprawling, well-loved farmstead, filled with the laughter of children and the steady, contented rhythm of a life built not on comfort alone, but on something far sturdier. Devotion, freely given and freely returned. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Marcella and Nathan sat together on the porch he had built for her, watching their 3 children chase fireflies across the yard as the summer sky deepened into violet and gold. Thomas, now 11, was showing his younger siblings how to cup the insects gently in their hands without crushing them, patient and careful in a way that reminded Marcella, achingly, of his father at the same age, or so she imagined, though she had never known Nathan as a boy. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathan asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders, his voice carrying the particular softness it always took on in these quiet evening moments. Turning down the Marshal, choosing all this instead. Marcella leaned her head against his shoulder, watching Ruth shriek with delighted laughter as a firefly escaped through her fingers and drifted up into the darkening sky. "Not for one single moment," she said. "I chose dirt, Nathan Hale. I chose devotion. And I would choose it again every single time for the rest of my life." He turned his head and kissed her temple, gentle and unhurried, the way he had learned to kiss her over 10 years of shared mornings, and shared hardships and shared, quiet joys. "I love you," he said, the same words he had promised never to let a day pass without speaking, and though he had kept that promise faithfully for a decade now, the words still carried, each time, the same weight and wonder they had held on the night he first spoke them beside a small fire on the open prairie, a plain silver ring trembling in his hand. "I love you too," Marcella said, and meant it with every part of the heart she had once offered a Marshal out of practicality, and had instead given, fully and forever, to a farmer with nothing but dirt and devotion to his name. The fireflies rose in slow, glowing spirals above the wheat fields, and the children's laughter carried on the warm evening air, and somewhere beyond the fence line, the land that had nearly been stolen from them, the land that had been fought for and saved and built into something lasting, stretched out green and golden and entirely, gloriously theirs. They stayed there together on the porch long after the children had been called in and put to bed, long after the fireflies had faded into the deepening dark, simply sitting in the comfortable silence of two people who had built a whole life together out of almost nothing, and who understood in their bones that almost nothing, given enough love and enough devotion, could grow into everything a person could ever want. In the years that followed, Willow Bend continued to grow, as towns across the Kansas prairie so often did in those decades, drawing in new families and new hopes with every passing season. Marcella's father lived long enough to see all 3 of his grandchildren grown into their teenage years, and he passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, content and surrounded by the family he had helped build. His store passed down eventually to Thomas, who ran it with the same careful attention his grandfather always had. Nathan Hale's farm became, in time, one of the most respected and productive in the county, and when younger farmers came through struggling with failed crops or debts they could not see their way clear of, it was often to Nathan's porch they came for advice, finding in him not just a successful farmer but a man who understood, more than most, what it meant to nearly lose everything and to fight, with everything he had, to keep it. And Marcella, who had once stood on her father's store porch and turned away the comfortable, practical proposal of a Marshal in favor of an uncertain future with a struggling farmer, never once looked back with regret. She had chosen in that moment not security but love, not comfort but devotion, and in the choosing she had built a life richer and fuller than any silver star or steady wage could ever have promised her. The dirt beneath their feet, once feared for its stubbornness and its unforgiving nature, had become, through years of shared labor and shared love, something sacred. The ground on which they had built a home, raised their children, buried their losses, and celebrated their joys. It was, in the end, exactly as Nathan had promised on that cold December night beside a small prairie fire, not much to look at, perhaps, to anyone passing through, but it was everything. It was theirs. And as the years turned into decades, and their children grew and married and brought grandchildren of their own to visit the old farmhouse porch, Marcella Hale would often be found sitting there in the evenings, her husband's hand resting warm and familiar in hers, watching the sun set gold and orange over the wheat fields they had built together from nothing. And she would think, every single time, of a fence rail and a ruined cornfield and a man who had asked her to wait, and she would smile, knowing without a single doubt that she had made, all those years ago, exactly the right choice.